You step outside in Giza at noon in July. The air reads 46 degrees Celsius, about 115 degrees Fahrenheit. But the sand under your feet is hotter, close to 70 degrees Celsius. Bare skin blisters against it in seconds. Sweat lifts off your skin before it can even bead. Within 20 minutes of real exertion, your core temperature starts climbing toward a danger zone. Now, here's the disruption. Around 2560 BCE, the men who built the Great Pyramid of Giza hauled limestone blocks averaging 2.5 tons apiece, in shifts lasting most of the day, under this same sun. They had no sunscreen, no electrolyte packets, no refrigerated water, and modern exercise physiologists have found that the human body has a hard ceiling for heat like this. Once what's called the wet bulb temperature crosses about 35 degrees Celsius, sweat stops cooling you effectively, and heat stroke becomes a matter of time, not chance. What follows isn't only the story of how one civilization outlasted the hottest desert on Earth for roughly 3,000 years. It's the story of how that desert reshaped the bodies that built it. And pieces of that reshaping are still sitting inside you. Start with Deir el-Medina, a purpose-built village on the Nile's west bank, founded around 1550 BCE to house the craftsmen who carved and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings nearby. Somewhere between 68 and 120 families lived there across its 450-year history. And unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient world, we know their exact work schedule. Not from tomb inscriptions, but from thousands of limestone flakes called ostraca, used as ancient Egypt's version of scratch paper. The Egyptian calendar split each month into 3 10-day weeks, called decans. Deir el-Medina's workers got the 9th and 10th day off, plus roughly a third of the year in religious festival holidays. One modern count puts it near 65 days annually. Shifts began before sunrise. Ostraca studied by Czech Egyptologist Jaroslav Černý in the mid-20th century, record crews stopping entirely during the hottest hours, then returning to the tomb shafts once the sun dropped. Absences were logged too. Eye trouble, a scorpion sting, one man out for days brewing beer for a festival. But timing the workday around the sun was only the first layer of the strategy. The desert didn't just dictate when Egyptians worked. It rewrote what they wore, what they built, and, over enough generations, what their bodies looked like. Clothing was the first adaptation, and it worked against the sun instead of trying to block it entirely. Ancient Egyptians wore linen, woven from flax grown along the Nile floodplain, in the Fayum region especially. Undyed linen reflects roughly 35 to 40% more sunlight than darker cotton weaves tested by modern textile researchers. Garments were loose, kilts for laborers, wrapped sheaths for others, leaving a layer of air between fabric and skin that let sweat evaporate instead of pooling. Even the iconic striped Nemes headdress seen on Tutankhamun's death mask wasn't just ceremonial. Cloth draped over the neck and shoulders shielded the two areas most exposed to direct overhead sun. Architecture did the rest. In Deir el-Medina and across the Nile Valley, homes were built from mudbrick, Nile silt mixed with straw and dried, not fired, so the walls stayed thick, often 50 centimeters or more. Mudbrick has low thermal conductivity. It absorbs heat slowly through the day and releases it slowly at night, keeping interiors 10 to 15 degrees Celsius cooler than the air outside. Windows were small and set high, cutting direct glare while still allowing hot air to rise and escape. A wall painting in a Theban tomb dated to around 1300 BCE, during the reign of Amenhotep III, shows one of the earliest known depictions of a Malkoff. A wind-catching tower angled to funnel cooler air down into a home's interior. Persia would later refine the same idea into the badgir. Egypt appears to have built it first. But clothing and architecture only manage heat from the outside. The desert had already been working on Egyptian bodies from the inside, across thousands of years, long before the pyramids existed at all. In 1877, American zoologist Joel Asaph Allen proposed what's now called Allen's Rule. Populations native to hot climates tend to develop longer, leaner limbs relative to torso size, which increases surface area and lets the body shed heat faster. Skeletal studies of Nile Valley populations, including analyses published from excavations at sites like Nakata, show exactly this pattern: a linear body build, narrow hips, elongated forearms and lower legs, distinct from the more compact frames typical of populations from colder regions. This wasn't a cultural choice. It was thousands of years of the Sahara and the Nile floodplain selecting, generation after generation, for bodies that dumped heat efficiently. Skin followed the same logic. Higher melanin concentration, common across populations with long histories in high UV latitudes, absorbs and scatters ultraviolet radiation before it can damage the DNA in skin cells, a defense against the same sun that was simultaneously trying to cook them alive. So the Egyptians arrived at the desert already partly built for it. And yet none of that, not linen, not mudbrick, not millennia of adaptation, solved the single biggest threat the pyramid workforce faced every single day. It wasn't heat. It was what heat does to a body that runs out of water. At Giza, roughly 1.5 kilometers south of the pyramids, archaeologists Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass began excavating a settlement in the 1990s now known as the Lost City of the Pyramid Builders. What they found wasn't slave quarters. It was industrial-scale bakeries and breweries, vats and hearths capable of feeding thousands of workers a day, dated to roughly 2500 BCE during the reigns of Khufu and Khafre. The math behind that infrastructure is what matters. A laborer moving stone in Giza heat, under heavy exertion, can lose 1 to 1.5 liters of sweat per hour. Sustained over an 8 to 10 hour shift, that's a water debt of 8 to 12 liters. Impossible to replace with river water alone, especially when that water carried waterborne risk. So the workforce was rationed bread and beer instead, in massive quantities. Bread supplied dense calories. Beer, likely under 2% alcohol and thick with fermented barley, supplied both hydration and a sterilized alternative to raw Nile water. It wasn't recreation. It was logistics. Diet closed the loop the desert had opened. Salt lost through sweat causes hyponatremia if it isn't replaced, a condition that, left untreated, produces confusion, seizures, and death, something modern endurance athletes still study today. Onions, garlic, and radishes, recorded by the Greek historian Herodotus around 440 BCE as rations distributed to pyramid workers, are naturally high in sodium and potassium. Whether or not Herodotus's specific account is fully reliable, the underlying pattern holds. A workforce moving stone in lethal heat needed a precisely engineered intake of water, salt, and calories just to survive to the next shift, let alone build a monument that would outlast every empire that came after it. Layer all of it together. The sunrise shifts logged on Deir el-Medina's ostraca, the linen that breathed, the mudbrick that held its cool through the afternoon, the malkaf pulling wind down into a house, the long, lean limbs shaped by 10,000 years of Saharan selection, the melanin absorbing radiation meant for a cell's DNA, the bread and beer replacing what the sun pulled out of the body by the liter, and the pyramids stop looking like a story about stone. They start looking like a story about thermoregulation. Egypt didn't defeat the desert. It negotiated with it, at the level of architecture, agriculture, and eventually the human genome itself. You still carry pieces of that negotiation, whether or not your ancestry traces anywhere near the Nile. Every mechanism your body uses to survive a heat wave, sweating, vasodilation, the craving for salt after exertion, is the same toolkit being tested 4,000 years ago in a workers' village outside Giza. The pyramids are usually framed as a monument to what Egyptians built against the sky. They might be better understood as a record of what the sun built into the bodies that built them.